This was my home, until I came back from Buenos Aires and found it empty. The key turned in a lock that felt foreign in my hand. The door sighed open without resistance. My footsteps made the loudest sound in the world. 1, 2, a hollow echo down the hallway where the photographs used to hang. The cushions were gone. The rug near the sofa lay flat as if it had never been walked on. The bookshelf, a whole wall's worth of stories, had been stripped clean. The gold-edged copies of books I loved were missing. The little ceramic cat my aunt brought from the coast, gone. The stainless steel kettle that had always stood on the counter like a faithful sentinel was not there. The place smelled faintly of lemon, an antiseptic attempt to erase what had been. On the coffee table, placed unnervingly centered on a bare expanse of wood, was a single sheet of white paper. No handwriting I recognized at first, no flourish, no apology, 3 lines. I read them twice because my brain tried to persuade my heart that I had misread. I emptied the house. Do not contact me. Speak to my lawyers. There was no signature. There did not need to be. I sat down where the couch used to be. My body expected fabric and found only the ghost of it. My phone in my pocket felt suddenly heavy. I called him. The call went to voicemail. A recorded woman's voice said, precise and neutral, "The number you have dialed is unavailable. Please leave a message." The recorded message belonged to a service we had shared for years, until it did not anymore. I wandered the rooms like a traveler in a city after a storm, where everything familiar had been swept away. I opened the bedroom closet. His shoes. No, not his shoes. They were there, placed in neat pairs, but under them, the empty spaces where my dresses had hung felt like a removed organ. The jewelry box was gone, so was the heavy mirror with its ornate frame. In the kitchen, the spice rack was gone, but the little jar of oregano we'd brought from our first trip remained. Absurd and small and impossible to understand. A slow nausea rose in me. Not only had my belongings been taken, someone had picked through the house like someone reading a diary and deciding which lines to keep. There was a receipt fanned on the counter, as if left intentionally for discovery. A document from a moving company, stamped with a city name and a date 3 days earlier than today. A small business card underneath it. At first I thought it was an estate agent's, then I saw the printed name and the word I had been avoiding, lawyer. Beside it, a photograph folded into quarters. I opened it with fingers that wouldn't obey me. It was a photograph of me, not posed, not recent in the way I understood then. It was a candid, me laughing in a cafe in Buenos Aires, hair damp from rain, an arm thrown around someone whose face was deliberately cropped out. I recognized the raincoat draped over my shoulders, the cafe window reflecting neon, the crooked umbrella we'd shared. The back of the photo had been stamped with a date and a time. The edges were crisp. This was not a memory I had misplaced. This photo was a file, a record, an accusation. For a while I stood there and tried to rewrite what I knew into a less violent version. He couldn't have done this, I thought. He would never. But the house was empty, and the note was there, and my photographs had a detective's stamp on the back. In the kitchen trash, between receipts, I found an envelope. Inside was a printout. Private investigation, evidence collection. The header was impersonal. The content was merciless. It listed dates, GPS coordinates, photographs taken from a distance, and an audio file with a transcript. I read the transcript aloud because reading someone else's meticulous wording felt safer than feeling. Transcript excerpt. 2019-06-12, 2304. Car. I said I didn't want to complicate things. 2019-06-13, Ilvo 12, hotel lobby. We should be careful. What if he finds out? 2019-06-13, Zerwolf 35, room. Indistinct laughter. Tomorrow we'll pretend it's nothing. There was also a note at the bottom. Client requested discreet collection. Evidence admissible under contract X. I flinched at the clinical phrasing. Admissible, contract, evidence, words that turned a life into a case file. I called him again. No answer. I left a message, or tried. Where are you? Why is the house? My voice came out small and uncentered. The line was swallowed by the same recorded woman's voice. The first hour after discovery blurred into a few sharp memories. The last morning before the trip, his face neutral at the doorway as we loaded the suitcases. The flight, the handshake of the security agent who scanned my passport and had no idea what I would be hiding. the rain in Buenos Aires that had felt like permission. The rest of the day receded like a bad dream I could not wake from. When I finally sat on the front step and let my phone die between my palms, I felt ridiculous and exposed. I pictured him on the other end, packing, unloading, calculating. I imagined the lawyer making phone calls. I imagined my photographs, the ones I had thought were private, being printed and catalogued, each moment of my betrayal reduced to evidence-bearing timestamps. If you're watching this and feel the heat in your chest like the one I had that day, tell me where you're from in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone. It was not the first fracture between us, but it was the first one that smacked concrete. We had been a weathered couple. Some storms had passed without a single bone broken. We had grooves worn into us by habit, the chair he preferred at the kitchen table, the exact moment he would reach for the remote, the little ritual of sharing coffee on Saturday mornings while reading headlines on our old tablet. Once those subtleties were a language between us. Later they became scaffolding that could be cleared away. The signs looking back were small and ordinary, the way small things often are. He began locking his phone more. He cleared his browsing history and sighed when I found his coffee mug with lipstick stains that weren't mine in the dishwasher. He started staying late at work, or said he did. He would call from the parking garage, a whisper of a voice, and tell me he'd be home soon without the homecoming he used to bring. Sometimes his answers were clipped, sometimes he was laughably pleasant, like a man practicing kindness at a distance. I interpreted these as his issues, not mine. I folded them into the narrative that served me best, that ours was a marriage with problems, not disasters. And then I planned the trip. I had not planned to leave home. The Buenos Aires trip had been a break, a conversation that started as a joke between two people who wanted to be spoilers of their own lives. The lover, his name is Daniel, we met in a way that risk always announced itself as possibility. Through a project, through a long night of work that wandered into coffee and then into hours that had nothing to do with deadlines. Daniel was clever in a way I mistook for destiny. He knew which parts of me were tender and which parts were bored. When he suggested we take a weekend to breathe, it felt like a lifeline and simultaneously like betrayal. It was a choice I made anyway. Buenos Aires was humid and bright. The hotel was a small Art Deco place in a neighborhood lined with jacarandas. We walked at night, the city pulsing with tango and neon and the smell of frying dough. I remember a corridor carpet damp from last night's rain and the lights in the room reflected off a glossy painting. I remember thinking at the time that I was both younger and older than I had ever been. There were photographs taken that showed a side of me I recognized and did not recognize. Leaning close to a man whose name was on my tongue like a secret, hands tucked under a scarf. A laugh that looked like release. The affair was not a movie. It was small betrayals stitched together, text messages sent on the sly, a few clandestine meetings, the adrenaline of hiding details from a person you once trusted most. It felt like repair at first, a misguided belief that an outside promise could fix the fissures we had ignored inside our marriage. In those nights, I told myself we were not breaking anything. We were only learning new sides of ourselves. I did not think about the future consequences. I lived in the immediacy of stolen time. Back home, his changes intensified. I thought I was clever. I cleared my messages. I stopped leaving things out. I bought a new lipstick and put it in my suitcase because it made me feel protected. I told myself that the heart wants what it wants, and the heart had wanted Daniel. I did not account for my husband hiring a man who watched. I learned later how the detective had worked. The details were filed like a science project in the envelope on my counter. The report included grainy photographs shot from a distance. Me under the umbrella, me leaving a cafe at midnight with my coat slung over my arm, me and Daniel stepping into a hotel doorway. There were GPS logs that placed two phones near each other at precise moments, and a purchase receipt from a hotel reception with a card that matched the last 4 digits of mine. There was an audio file recorded through a device left in a car that caught a private conversation I thought was safe. Hearing it out of context felt like eavesdropping on myself. Audio transcript, excerpt. You make everything less heavy, me. I don't want to hurt him, Daniel. We will be careful, me. Laughter, indistinct. When I read the detective's notes, clinical descriptions, times, distances, I felt like a woman standing at the edge of a courtroom, accused before a jury of strangers. The evidence said I had been caught. The evidence did not consider how I had arrived at that place. The evidence simply existed, impartial as rain. I remember calling my friend Mara that night. I told her the house was empty. She did not gasp. She did not say, "What did you expect?" She asked quietly, "Did you know your husband had changed?" I wanted to tell her everything and nothing at once. I wanted to speak in absolutes, that I had loved him, that I had been lonely, that this was not who I had wanted to be. Instead, I told her about the photograph and the note and the moving receipt. She came over an hour later and sat on the neighbor's step like someone waiting for a bus that never came. Her eyes were hard as a stone held in her mouth. "You need a lawyer," she said. The sentence landed like a clap of thunder. We were already speaking in that language: attorneys, contracts, evidence. The vocabulary of finality had arrived like a guest who forgot to leave. My husband, Raphael, found ways to be present even when absent. He had always been a man of details: the smoothness of his tie, the exactness of the angle at which he folded our napkins. He was not violent, he was not theatrical, he was, before all else, precise. That precision is what made the empty house feel surgically intentional. It wasn't an act of rage so much as an act of organization. He catalogued, he labeled, he placed a note where I would find it. He used lawyers not as thunderbolts, but as instruments to reshape a life. Over the next few days, details arrived like mail. An email from a firm with legal subject lines I didn't open at first. A voicemail from an unknown number that turned out to be a court clerk. A photograph attached to a PDF. Me, again, but this time in a parking lot, backing into a car with a hotel key in my hand. Every file drew lines around me that left smaller and smaller free space to breathe. At my sister's insistence, I opened the PDF. The document was a formal notification, notice of separation and claim for compensation. It named me and the other party, and it asked for restitution, not only a divorce, the letter said, but an indemnity for emotional damage and loss. The phrase emotional damage read like a malformed idea. How did you put a price on what we had been? The notice was matter-of-fact. The law, in its best intentions, wraps human mess in paper and stamps. It reduces grief to currencies and signatures. I did not leave the house for 2 days. I slept on the steps in the evening, inhaling the same air that had filled the home that no longer belonged to me. People called with opinions. Friends I had drunk with in other years offered cold comfort and warm condemnation. His mother sent a terse message: "We are confused." My mother attempted to bridge the distance with worry words that didn't fit. Our social circle split into halves. Some avoided answering my messages. Others took my side with a doggedness that felt as hollow as denial. There was a man named Eduardo who worked the front desk at the boutique hotel we had used in Buenos Aires. He answered my international call by coincidence because Daniel had left his wallet at the desk and my husband had somehow chased down every receipt. Eduardo remembered a woman who had been in a hurry, who had asked for late checkout. He remembered a laugh and the little argument about whether to take breakfast in the room. Those recollections, innocuous to him, were file material to someone else. The world, I learned, has many registers for the same moment: memory, documentary, and judgment. Part of me wanted to demand my things back. Another part wanted to crawl into a hole and never be observed again. The act that had seemed like an inevitable consequence, the affair, had been one thing. The consequences themselves were another. When Raphael used the law as a mechanism, he did not only seek to reclaim material value, he sought to mark the boundaries of the life we shared. He wanted the house emptied not simply to punish possessions, but to create a new topology in which I had less purchase. I found an index in the envelope labeled Evidence and Inventory. It catalogued our life in numbers. Sofa, Model X, appraised market value Y. Bookshelf, handmade, value Z. Artwork, removed, sold at auction, €2, €7. There were small receipts from pawn shops and transfer confirmations from online marketplaces, bearing dates that matched the moving company's stamp. The bedroom mirror's appraised sale price was more than I had expected. The notes read, like someone assembling a ledger for a life they intended to close. My first instinct was to rage. I wanted to call the moving company and block the shipment. I wanted to force my way into the warehouse where my things would be stored or sold. I knew, in some rational part of myself, that trespass would not fix what had been bought and sold between us. Rage, without law, would only muddle the narrative into illegality, but even as that rational voice spoke, another voice whispered of revenge and of fairness and of the tiny mathematics of dignity. The detective's report also contained messages between Daniel and me, not intimate messages in the sense I think the court emphasized, but the kind of text you send when you're trying to map a secret. "We need to be careful," one message read. "I know," I had typed. There was a string where the tone changed from daring to worried. I thought my carefulness would suffice. I was wrong. When the first attorney's letter arrived on our doormat, the one with the header in bold type and a seal, it was both ordinary and catastrophic. It announced that Raphael had filed for divorce and for compensatory relief in view of conjugal non-compliance. The phrasing felt anciently formal. Conjugal non-compliance, a phrase that reframed our marriage as a breach, a contract violated. The legal words felt like the nails in the coffin of what we had been. I remember the day I realized that my public image had been affected. My phone vibrated with messages from clients. An email from a publisher asked if I would comment on a professional matter, and when I hesitated, their tone shifted. Business is sensitive to scandal. As the details of my private life, including insinuations that trailed like dust, seeped into circles I had thought impermeable, I felt a loneliness that was keyed differently than domestic solitude. It was a social solitude, acquaintances becoming cautionary tales, partners calling less, the slow drying up of invitations that had once arrived like rain. But the hardest part, apart from the emptiness of the house, was how my own narrative had shrunk. I had always pictured myself in many layers. Daughter, professional, lover, friend. Suddenly, one attribute became a headline. The woman who had an affair. It framed everything else. People called me by that one role, and I felt my identity flatten to it, like a pressed flower. There were conversations that felt like interrogations disguised as concern. His friends, the ones who had known us both, approached me at a cafe and did not look at my eyes. "You didn't think about how this would affect everyone?" one asked. I wanted to ask them if they had ever felt lonely in a marriage where small disappointments accumulate until there is nothing left to hold them back from making a choice. But the words stayed coiled behind my teeth. At night, I would play small scenes in my head. Me, furious, dragging boxes back into the house. Me, contrite, asking for forgiveness on my knees. Me, laughing in the rain like that picture, free and unmoored. The legal reality offered little space for that theater. The law wanted documentation. The law wanted sums and signatures. The law wanted to trade symbolic restitution for the intangible damage that had been done to trust. One morning, a man from the moving company called me. His voice was straightforward, almost bored. "We have items to deliver," he said. "I believe there's been a miscommunication." I asked for details. He read from a ledger. "Items removed from the residence located at address, consigned to storage on date X, sold, itemized list available upon request." His bureaucratic voice described things as if they were catalogued birds. My voice cracked when I responded. "Who authorized it?" I asked. He read me a name, Raphael's. "There's been legal authority," the man said. He was not cruel. He was an instrument of a process I had been excluded from. "I can't do anything," he added, which is a sentence more cutting than the cruelest accusation because it establishes impotence. I found myself at an intersection of emotion and legality. There was rage, yes, but also an odd relief, merciful, absurd, at seeing things take a shape. If the world insisted on adjudicating this with receipts and witnesses and lawyers, then there was a kind of order. I could perhaps respond in that tongue. The realization was chilling and oddly comforting. If my infidelity had become a ledger item, maybe I could contest the sums. Maybe I could fight to salvage what I wanted. Still, I sat in the emptiness and let the hours slide away. The silence in rooms that once hummed with our lives had a quality like the hush at the beginning of a funeral. I found myself cataloging memories instead of furniture. The dinner on the balcony where he told me he had been offered a promotion. The night we fought about a financial decision and later rebuilt our apologies over wine. The fights, the reconciliations, small acts of mending that had once sustained us. It turned out they had been more fragile than I believed. On the third day, a man I had not met before arrived at the door. He introduced himself as Raphael's lawyer. He was not the man from the note. He was younger, efficient, his suit pressed as if it had ironed out the edges of compassion. He handed me a copy of the petition. I wanted to refuse it. I wanted to fling the paper into the street and stomp it beneath my shoes. Instead, I took it with a hand that trembled. "We need to discuss arrangements," he said. He used the phrase as if it were neutral. Nothing about that phrase felt neutral to me. "There are items to be inventoried and liabilities to be discussed. Also, there is the possibility of an indemnity claim." He said the last words like someone reciting a recipe. "You can't just take everything," I said, and I surprised myself with the steadiness of my voice. I had rehearsed that line in my mind like an incantation. The lawyer smiled politely, the smile of someone who had counseled others through angry households. "We have a court order," he answered. "The inventory was completed with your consent through counsel." He handed me a photocopy of a document that bore my signature. I looked at it like a stranger would look at a photograph of their past self. The signature was mine, but the consent wasn't. My name had been on a legal paper that established a reality I did not remember authorizing. I read every line with the attention of someone translating an unfamiliar language. Somewhere in the small print, there was a clause about marital goods and demonstrated non-compliance. It was like reading a dictionary of accusations. My signature was on a line at the bottom. I did not remember signing it. The lawyer noticed my pause and produced a phone record showing that Raphael had visited a notary with a witness present. "He came on the 28th, the lawyer said, as if narrating a benign event. "You were traveling." The truth of the matter settled in me like cold. A person can be represented in their absence in ways that reconfigure reality. Papers can be signed, and, in the right circumstances, they do the work that flesh and conversation cannot. The law had turned an absence into a ballot. I had left, and in leaving I had opened a space where someone could write a different ending. That night, I stayed on the steps for a long time. The city lights looked the same as they had before. Taxis still slid by and people still shouted in the distance. But the house, that impossible human container of our history, had been rearranged by someone who used the instruments of order. I understood then that this was not only about loss, it was about erasure. He had, with legal calm, emptied more than furniture. He had removed my place in our life. In the quiet, my mind ran through possible narratives that would make me a hero or a martyr. It did not occur to me at that moment to be small. The story preferred grandeur. But the reality was tedious. Receipts, notices, phone calls, and the slow choreography of an attorney's schedule. The romance of a revenge plot is intoxicating only in fiction. In real life, it translates into forms and signatures and bank transfers. And yet, even as I sat there, a part of me smoldered. I imagined a courtroom where the pieces of our life were laid out like evidence in a museum exhibit. I imagined Raphael sitting across from me, precise as ever, and me attempting to explain in human language why I had done it. The imagination offered no solace, only the grim satisfaction that the truth would be told, weighed, and perhaps if not forgiven, at least accounted for. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old messages. There were exchanges between us that looked like fossils. Small apologies, invitations to dinner, the gentle language of two people who used to try. I read them as if reconstructing an archaeological site. In one thread, he had written, "We should talk when you get back." The words were patient, not accusatory. Another read, "Everything's fine here." Those messages felt like dust-covered artifacts, hinting at an earlier era of our story. That evening, Daniel called. His voice was raw with something, shame perhaps, or fear. "Are you okay?" he asked. I wanted to tell him to stay away, to be the man who had been the other and then vanish like smoke. But the voice on the line was the same voice that had comforted me in hotel rooms, and for a moment I forgot the ledger. "I'm fine," I said. It was not true. He asked if we should come back, if we should face him together. I heard the desperation in his voice, and I imagined the two of us stepping into a courtroom and feeling the eyes of a dozen witnesses upon us. "No," I said, and by saying it, I felt the wall close on something private. Saying no felt like a covenant with the legal world that had already started to rearrange my life. It felt like a surrender and a necessary survival. The next morning a summons arrived. It was clipped to the inner side of the door in an envelope stamped with the court's symbol. My name was printed in a font that made my heart beat faster. The contents requested my presence for mediation and included an inventory list of the household goods. There was also a notification of claim that outlined compensatory amounts Raphael's counsel planned to ask for. Numbers, figures, itemized damages for emotional suffering and material loss. They wanted the law to weigh the life we had, as if love could be amortized over a balance sheet. I stood in my empty living room holding that summons and felt something like vertigo. This is not a scene from a film where confession leads to reconciliation. There was no dramatic reunion, no grand catharsis. There was only paper, neutral, inevitable. I had been reduced to a case. In a strange way, relief came again. If the law had been called upon to settle our lives, then perhaps there would be clarity. I could hire counsel, I could fight, or I could accept. None of the options felt like a liberation. They all felt like survival strategies. That night, I drove to the hotel where we had stayed in the city for the weekend when we first met as colleagues. I wanted to be small and anonymous, to sit in a place that had no memory of our house. The city was indifferent to my personal catastrophe. People drank and laughed in the bar. The bartender, unfamiliar with our story, asked what I wanted. I ordered the simplest thing on the menu and felt my tongue numb with the taste of citrus. When I returned home, the white note still lay where I had left it, as if time had paused to let me stare at it again. I took a picture and sent it to Daniel, because what else do you do when you want a witness? He replied with a single heart emoji and a short message. I'm here when you need me. The message was a tiny anchor. I saved it like a prayer. On the fourth day, a neighbor knocked on the door. She had been one of those people who had once celebrated our small successes. The baby shower across the hall, the casserole she brought when Raphael had the flu. She seemed smaller now, as if the community's gravity had shifted. People talk, she said, as if conveying news. They say things. I wanted to ask who and what and when, to demand sources and names. Instead, I found myself apologizing without knowing why. Listen, she said, if you need anything. Her eyes were watery but firm. Some of the people who had stood with us at anniversaries still offered kindness in small measures. It meant something, like a tender hand over a wound. But for every gesture there seemed to be a counteracting force. Calls not returned, a client who postponed a meeting, a friend who refused to be associated with me in public. The ostracism was slow and surgical. It did not shout. It simply thinned the density of my daily life until the social skin I had wrapped myself in felt paper thin. At night, when everything was quiet, I tried to reconcile my image. The woman in the photographs, laughing in the rain, radiant in a way I had not expected, and the woman who stood in an empty house with a legal fold in her future. Which one was truer? Both, it seemed, and neither could be excused. I started to collect the evidence that had been thrust upon me. If the world wanted a war of documents, I would build my own file. I made a list of the things I remembered: receipts, dismissals, moments of kindness, and embarrassingly, small proofs of a life lived with someone who had loved me in ways that could not be quantified. I photographed what remained in the house: the jar of oregano, the little chipped plate my mother gave me, the empty hooks on the wall. I wanted to hold on to some small proof that my life had been rich beyond what the lawsuit would acknowledge. I hired a lawyer for myself, not because I trusted him, but because the ledger required a ledger. He was a woman, a sharp, brisk attorney who packed words like tools. We can contest the inventory values, she said. We can argue about process. We can negotiate. She never said forgive or understand, which is what I had started craving in private moments. The legal mind works in clauses and deadlines. It does not tend to the heart. Together with her, I began to assemble an answer. We requested copies of the moving receipts. We asked for proof of sale. We demanded to know whether the items had truly been sold or only consigned. I learned to say, "We object," and "we request disclosure," phrases that tasted foreign on my tongue. There was a small, perverse satisfaction in responding to the forms of accusation with the exact instruments the accusers had chosen. At night, after the calls and the meetings, I would sit in a cafe with an espresso and stare at the reflection of my face in the window. It looked older than it should have. Lines had deepened in places where I had not noticed them before. The weight of my choices had physical consequence. It pulled on my shoulders like an invisible bag full of stones. One morning, I received an envelope from Raphael's counsel with a photograph attached. It was a photograph of him at the house the week before, removing a painting from the wall. There was a note in the margin, "Client's property removal in compliance with court order." The picture was not an accusation as much as an instruction manual. Even the act of reclaiming his own items was framed in administrative correctness. The world had become a place where we negotiated moral life through paperwork. I have been asked by some if I regretted what I had done. The honest answer is complex. There was regret, sharp, immediate, for the pain I had caused. There was also a clear-eyed acknowledgement that the marriage had been leaky long before I stepped into another person's arms. To place all blame on one person or one action is to ignore the slow erosion that precedes catastrophe. Still, comprehension does not equal exoneration. Understanding why a thing happens does not mean excusing it. When a close friend suggested that I issue a public statement, I laughed at how ridiculous that sounded. To compose a press release for your moral failings is a peculiar form of modern humiliation. Yet, in a strange sense, whether I liked it or not, my life had become public in ways I had not prepared for. I found myself policing conversations not only for truth, but for the impressions they would leave. It is astonishing how much of our moral economy lately depends on how we are perceived in public. Weeks moved like pages in a book being turned too fast. There were hearings scheduled and rescheduled, depositions, the filing of documents and counters with titles that were designed to be neutral, request for mediation, response to claim. The adventure of romance had curdled into the monotony of legal procedure, but the consequences were real. Items sold, relationships strained, reputations altered. There was no single villain in this story. There were many tiny choices and one large betrayal. The empty house became the image of the loss. One late afternoon I visited the storage facility where some of our things had been taken. I had the inventory number, the date, and the name of the company. The facility smelled of cardboard and machine oil. Rows of boxes stretched into fluorescent-lit distance. A clerk signed something and handed me a receipt. Inside one of the boxes, wrapped in newspaper, was the little ceramic cat my aunt had given me. It looked out of place in its parcel, like a survivor. I wanted to clutch it to my chest and run. I wanted to retrieve everything and rebuild. But the clerk explained quietly that many items had been sold or transferred under authority. The boxes held a few remnants, not the whole life. I picked up the cat anyway and felt a rush of gratitude and ridiculous joy. The survival of small things can feel like a mercy when larger structures collapse. It is astonishing how attached we become to objects as emblems of continuity. When I left the storage, the sun was beginning to set. There was a shadow in the parking lot. Raphael, alone, lighting a cigarette. He looked older and smaller than in my memory. For a brief second, we were two strangers who had been intimate and then had evolved into adversaries. He watched me with the same precise gaze that had emptied our house. We said nothing. The distance between us had been administered by legal papers and decisions. He turned and walked away. I watched the cigarette glow until it winked out. That night, I took out the photograph from the envelope, the grainy print of me in the cafe. I studied the contours of my face, the angle of the smile. I tried to remember why I had chosen the path I did. There were reasons. Loneliness, the seductive invitation of attention, a belief in the myth that our inner lives could be renewed by clandestine escapades. There were also excuses, slender and flimsy. I could enumerate them and still feel inadequate. When I placed the photo back on the counter, I found a sticky note tucked beneath it, a line of writing in a familiar hand. "You left your scarf. You always leave your scarf." It was not signed. The handwriting could have been his. It could have been anyone's. The absurd tenderness of the message made me laugh, which surprised me because laughter felt like disloyalty to sorrow. Perhaps that morning Raphael had found my scarf and decided to be petty instead of cruel. Or perhaps he wanted me to feel the echo of what had been. Either way, the note landed between the practical cruelty of an emptied house and a trace of human history that could not be entirely erased. I made a promise to myself then, a brittle, hopeful thing, that I would not let the legal machinery and the gossip and the catalogue of losses become the totality of my story. That promise did not mean denial of responsibility, nor did it mean denial of pain inflicted on others. It merely suggested that, inside the ledger, in the quiet spaces between receipts and hearings, there might be room for repair. Not easy repair. Not necessarily mutual. But some form of mending that begins with accountability and leads toward a life I could live with. The next morning, the first mediation session was scheduled. I put on a shirt whose collar I liked and tried to find a voice that could both own my mistakes and ask for fairness. I thought of the empty rooms and the white note and the photograph and every small kindness that had preceded the collapse. I thought, too, of the people who would not speak to me now and the ones who would. I rehearsed sentences that sounded honest in the privacy of my apartment and awkward when said aloud. The law's language hung over everything. When I walked into the mediation room, there was a long table and 2 chairs and a small pot plant in the corner. The mediator smiled with a professional blandness and asked if we were ready. Raphael sat across from me, his posture straight, his hands folded. For a moment, I wanted to fling open my throat and explain all that I had felt and undone and meant. Instead, I listened to the mediator outline the agenda. Inventory, claims, possible restitution, timelines. It felt like a dentist's office for the life we had shared. Clinical, necessary, intimate in the exact way procedures are intimate. They probe and expose with gloved hands. Raphael didn't flinch when the mediator outlined the inventory. He only nodded, as if he were following a recipe that he knew by heart. When it was my turn to speak, my voice scraped like a tool that hadn't been used in years. I said what I had rehearsed, an admission, an apology, a request for fairness. My lawyer interposed with questions that were sharper and less sentimental. The mediator suggested we consider staggered payments, access to a few personal items for sentimental reasons, and the possibility of reducing certain valuations if we could show inconsistency in appraisal. Daniel's name came up. The room went cold in the way a window does when you place your palm against it. The mediator read aloud what the law allowed and what it did not. Raphael's counsel made a calm pitch. The affair caused conjugal non-compliance, and therefore there was ground for compensation. They had attached the detective's photos, the transcripts, the GPS trail. The images, when projected on the little screen, were merciless in their neutrality. A photograph of me stepping through a hotel threshold, a timestamp at the bottom like a small blinking judge. I felt naked not in body, but in the arithmetic of what had been done and when. In mediation there is theater and there is tradecraft. Raphael's demeanor was not performative, it was procedural. He placed a small stack of photographs face down. "I want this process to be efficient," he said. He did not look at me while he spoke. He did not need to. The room's air did the rest. My lawyer asked for time to consider his proposal. We emerged with an interim agreement. Certain items marked personal and irreplaceable would be returned if they could be located. Valuation disputes would be submitted to an independent appraiser. Payments could be made in installments. There was a clause, practical and terrible, that barred me from contacting Raphael directly. All communication would be via counsel. Outside the mediation room, the city felt louder. I walked until my legs ached and landed at a cafe where a woman I did not know was reading with the intensity of someone learning how to live again. I ordered coffee and watched the steam. My phone vibrated with messages I did not open. Daniel texted once, "Are you okay?" Later, his message changed to, "I will accept whatever comes." The words were empty and final. Perhaps that was best. There are some things that cannot be negotiated into tenderness. The case moved on to hearings. The detective who had compiled the dossier was called to testify. His voice in the court sounded like the one in the report. Businesslike, pared down. He took us through the photographs, the audio, the receipts. When the audio file played in the room, my own voice, softer than I remembered, saying words that had felt intimate and private, a physical nausea rose up in me. Hearing myself without the context of the night, reduced to a waveform and double-checked by timestamps, was like watching a film of a life I hadn't agreed to show. People cleared their throats politely. The judge listened with a look that felt like a balance scale on a human face. Raphael sat with his hands folded. He had asked the court for two things: a declaration of separation, the divorce, and compensatory relief, quantified in a sum intended to account for damages he argued the infidelity had caused. The figure named in the petition was large enough to be life-altering. It was also intentionally unrounded, precise in the way numbers are when someone has convinced themselves they are owed arithmetic rather than apology. Daniel appeared for his part. He was called to acknowledge his involvement and to face a claim for damages lodged by Raphael's counsel. He offered, through his own attorney, a statement of regret. The judge listened, then set dates for deliberation and ordered both parties to seek settlement before the final hearing. Between court dates, the public pressure showed its teeth. A small magazine that had previously profiled my work paused a project we had been developing together indefinitely. One of my contracts was quietly dissolved. A payment I had been counting on did not materialize. Emails from clients went cold. I received a brief, sterile message from a former collaborator. Due to circumstances, we will not be moving forward. Business is merciless in a different register. It does not moralize, it simply reallocates resources to those whose optics present less risk. A hearing, then, became not only a legal reckoning, but a financial one. When the judge finally issued a ruling on the outstanding claims, he used the language of balance and remedy rather than revenge. The court granted the divorce and ordered a compensatory payment to Raphael, partially upheld the claim against Daniel as a third party, the court noting his acknowledged participation, and allowed for a structured payment plan. The judgment did not read like vindication, it read like inventory. The sentences were precise and draining: division of assets, transfer documents, stipulated installments. In the end, I was given the legal right to oppose certain valuations and the option to appeal. The court's decision felt like a closing door that creaked but did not slam. In practical terms, the outcome meant immediate consequences. The house, our former house, was awarded to Raphael. He kept it, he said, with a calmness that suggested he wanted the space itself as a marker of victory, or perhaps as a refuge from what had become of both of us. I was ordered to pay part of the indemnity, and Daniel was ordered to pay his share. The sums were large enough to require negotiations about installments, tax considerations, and the liquidation of certain assets. The emotional harm had been reduced to numbers on a page. The financial hit was catastrophic for my life as it had been arranged. One of my projects had been my primary source of income, and when that evaporated, I found myself recalculating possibilities on a kitchen table I no longer inhabited. I sold what remained of my interest in a small side business. I took a modest job teaching a weekend writing workshop. It paid less than I had been used to, but it bought me time and oddly a sense of purpose. Teaching was humbling. It brought me closer to people who were not invested in my past, but interested in how to tell their own. The social fallout continued. Invitations dwindled. People I had brought to weddings and dinner parties now declined my messages. A cousin sent a carefully worded note that read like condolence and judgment at once. My mother, when we spoke on the phone, oscillated between sorrow and practical concern. "People are cruel," she said once, then added, "but they also forget." Her words were uneven, as all love is when it tries to be useful. There were moments of grace. Mara, who had sat on the neighbor's step, came through in ways that mattered. She brought lasagna on nights when my energy failed. She texted me at odd hours to offer nonsense talk that restored me to ordinary rhythm. The neighbor who had once said, "People talk," left a care package at my door, anonymously, with tea and a small hand-lettered card, for when things feel empty. Some people, despite rumors and whispers, held to what they had known of me beyond my mistakes. The process of paying the indemnity was long and humiliating. I signed up for an installment plan that smelled of austerity, monthly transfers that thinned out my savings, automatic reminders of a past I could not escape. I moved into a small studio across town, a place with a sloped ceiling and a window that looked into a courtyard full of fig trees. The rent was less than what I had been used to. The studio felt like a scaled-down map of my life. Essential furniture, a thin mattress, a table that had seen better days. At first, it felt like exile. Over time, it became a refuge in a different key. I kept the ceramic cat. I kept the jar of oregano. I kept a few books that smelled of past summers. Those items became sacred relics of continuity. They fit onto a narrow shelf I installed above the small stove. I arranged them as if curating an exhibit of persistence. The oregano sat by the window, and when I cooked, its scent threaded the apartment with memory. It was a small defiance against erasure. Months passed with the slow honesty of recovery. I went to therapy because the legal framework had its clarity, and my own heart did not. Therapy taught me to hold contradiction, that I could feel sorrow and guilt, and still want to be forgiven, but that forgiveness is a thing often outside one's control. The therapist suggested we explore not only my choices, but the structural patterns that had made those choices possible. Silence in the marriage, unmet needs, a shrinking of mutual curiosity. Accountability required naming those patterns without making them an excuse. I also took responsibility in other ways. I reached out to people I had hurt with notes that were simple and unperformative. I apologized to Raphael's mother directly, not to seek sympathy, but to acknowledge how my actions had rippled. Some refused to receive my words, others accepted them with a measured grace that felt like a small lamp in a dark room. It was important to me to make these gestures, not to clear my conscience fully, but to practice the discipline of making amends where possible. Daniel receded from my daily life. He paid his share as ordered, and then we drifted into a polite distance that resembled grief more than liberation. Sometimes I imagine the life we might have had if we had been honest earlier, or if the marriage had been different. Imagining, I learned, is a kind of ache that heals very slowly. Raphael acquired the house and the artifacts that came with it, and for a while appeared to steady himself with the ritual of domestic order. Yet people who saw him later said his eyes were shadowed in ways that said loss had a face on both sides. I did not take comfort in that. Seeing him diminished did not undo what had been done. If anything, it reminded me that our choices had consequences for all involved, not only for me. In the quieter months, I rebuilt in small increments. I took the weekend workshop teaching more seriously and found gratification in students unexpectedly owning their stories. One of them, Gabriela, enrolled in my class with a reserved intensity. She was younger than me by a decade, but carried a patience that felt like salt on an old wound. We began to talk after class, first about craft and then about practicalities, which cafes were open late, which bookstores offered discounts to teachers. Friendship settled in like a steady rain. Gabriela did not enter my life as a dramatic rescuer. She brought a kind of attention that required no redemption narrative. She listened when I spoke about the court dates as if she were tracing the lines of a map, and she did not flinch when I admitted my shame. There was a tenderness in shared errands, standing in line for the post office, choosing a paint sample for the studio's wall together, carrying a box of donated books to the charity shop. Those small tasks became training ground for trust. Months after the final hearing, on a Sunday afternoon, Gabriela brought over a slice of cake and a plant she had propagated from a cutting. "For your windowsill," she said, handing me the pot. We sat on my narrow sofa, a second-hand thing with a stubborn spring, and ate cake from paper plates. The conversation turned to banalities, a neighbor's noisy dog, a new shop down the street. Then, in a quieter moment, she reached across the table and put her hand on mine. The gesture was gentle and not loaded with expectation. It was an offer of company. I found I could accept it without twisting it into a promise. The years that followed the emptying of the house were not a quick arc toward redemption. There were setbacks. A contractor who ghosted me after I advanced money. A day when a columnist referenced my name in a roundup, and the old tremor of shame returned like an unwelcome echo. But there were also moments of lightness. A neighbor's invitation to a potluck, a student who published her first story and sent me a copy with a note thanking me for believing in her. I learned to measure life in smaller units than grand narratives. Once, by chance, I passed Raphael on the street. He had stopped by a bakery window, considering the loaves in an old way. The attention to small choices that had been his hallmark. We did not speak. We did not need to. In another life, perhaps we might have sat down and unpacked what happened. In the reality we inhabited, silence had become a form of civility. There is a particular grief that comes from losing not only things, but the shared imaginary of a life that could have been. I grieved for routines and rituals, the Saturday morning coffee, the grocery list written in his handwriting, the small agreements that had kept us moving. Where once those habits had felt like scaffolding, they had, in their removal, taught me how to build again with different materials. Sometimes people ask if I would do anything differently. I do not like hypothetical absolutes. The mind is generous with them. But I can say this. I would have asked for help earlier. I would have spoken to someone about the emptiness that had settled between Raphael and me. I would have been honest with my husband about what I was feeling before seeking relief elsewhere. Honesty is not a magic fix, but it is a different ledger. It writes the story in ways that leave less room for evidence to be the only narrative. I also learned painfully that revenge does not cure betrayal. Raphael's act of emptying the house was legal and deliberate, and it redrew our lives in ways that were irreversible. It did not make him whole. It did not heal the wounds that had led us there. The material recompense the court provided could not stitch back trust. Neither could my contrition. The legal world is not designed to repair intimacy. It is designed to adjudicate consequences. In time, my life contained new rituals. I learned to cook for myself in small, deliberate ways. I potted more plants on the windowsill. I took a walk every morning that was not intended to flee but to notice. The bakery owner sweeping his stoop, the woman who fed stray cats, the way light fell on the fig tree in the courtyard. The small details accumulated into a different kind of domesticity, a place where I could practice steadiness. On a cool evening some years later, I sat on my narrow balcony with a cup of tea and the ceramic cat on my knee. The jar of oregano sat on the sill, desiccated but still fragrant when crushed. My phone buzzed with a message from a student, a simple line. "We published the piece. Thank you." I felt a tenderness that was pure and earned. I texted back congratulations and closed my phone. There are moments when memory reaches for the house we once occupied and paints it in sharper colors than the court record recalls. I think of the balcony dinners that smelled of lemon and garlic, the way Raphael once hummed a song while balancing a saucepan, the private jokes we shared that had nothing to do with law or invoices. Those memories are mine. They are not erased because someone catalogued the couch and sold the painting on auction day. But they are rearranged now, stored in a different room of my mind that is quiet and tender, and not for exhibition. He emptied the house while I was away with my lover. That sentence will always carry its weight. An action and a consequence, a betrayal and a response. It is not the entire story. The house being empty forced me to confront the parts of myself I had been avoiding. It exacted a cost that was more than monetary. It demanded accountability. It also, in a strange and painful alchemy, made space for rebuilding with less of the pretense that our life was unbreakable. If you have been here with me through this, if you have felt any part of this story resonate, anger, curiosity, sorrow, or the small relief of knowing someone made mistakes and lived through them, leave a comment and tell me where you're from or what part touched you most. Follow for more stories like this. I will keep telling them because they matter, and because telling is how we learn to weigh what remains and arrange it gently into a life worth living.